In the summer of 1886, the people of Reed Lake, Dakota, watched the Vance widow do something that made no sense. She was building her house out of the marsh. Every morning she walked down to the slough with a billhook and a coil of twine, and every evening she came back with an armload of cut cattail reed dragging behind her in the dust. Her name was Ellen Vance. She was not yet 40, though the last winter had put gray in the hair at her temples and a stillness in her face that the young women in the settlement did not have. She had come to the lake with a husband and a claim and a wagon of borrowed tools. The husband, Samuel, was buried now under a wooden marker at the edge of the wheat, taken by the lung fever in February when the cold got into his chest and would not come out. What she had left was the claim, the tools, an 8-year-old daughter named Etta, and a brown shepherd dog named Tuck, who followed her to the slough and back and lay in the reed cuttings while she worked. The house she was building was small, no bigger than a granary, a low frame of green cottonwood poles she had raised herself with a block and a mule. That much the town could understand. A widow needed a roof. What they could not understand was what she meant to put over it. Not sawn shingles, not sod, not tar paper hauled in from the rail town 40 miles east. She meant to cover the whole thing, roof and walls alike, in cattail reed. She cut it green down in the water, and she stood it in shocks to dry as a man dries oats. And when it was dry and light and hollow, she bound it into tight round bundles as thick as her thigh. She counted them as she went. By the middle of July, she had 400. By mid-August, she had 700. She did not stop until she had 900, standing in ranks against the south wall of the unfinished house like sheaves, waiting for a thresher that would never come. A surveyor passing through could have written down the facts of it plainly. 900 bundles of dried cattail reed, each course laid over the last, and pinned down hard against the pole frame with split willow rods, so that the finished skin of the house stood a full 2 feet thick from the outside face of the reed to the poles beneath. A roof pitched steep, steeper than any cabin in the settlement, so steep the town said it looked like a haystack somebody had forgotten to level off. Not one shingle of milled lumber over her head. Not one board, a house sided and roofed entirely in marsh weed, standing golden and shaggy on the shore of a Dakota slough, in the summer before the worst winter anyone at Reed Lake would ever live to remember. The men noticed first, as men will notice a thing done wrong. Harlan Rourke had the claim next to hers, a tidy plank house he had bought ready cut and hauled in on 3 wagons, and he leaned on his fence in the evenings and watched her carry reed up from the water. "You're roofing yourself in with slough weed, missus," he said one evening, not unkindly, as you'd tell someone their cinch was loose. "First good wind off the flat is going to strip that clean to the poles. You'll be sleeping under stars by October." Ellen set down her armload and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the house for a moment before she answered him. When she did answer, it was 4 words, and she said them plain. "It keeps the heat." Then she picked the reed back up and carried it inside, and Tuck got up out of the dust and followed her, and Harlan Rourke went back to his own porch and told his wife the Vance widow had gone strange with grief, and there was nothing to be done about a woman who wouldn't be told. That is where this story could end, if you knew nothing more than the town knew. A grieving woman, a foolish house, a hard country waiting to punish anyone who did not build as the country said to build. But the town was wrong, and the reason they were wrong is the reason her chimney was the only one still smoking when the snow finally came. So keep the reed in your mind, keep the 2-foot thickness of it, and the 900 bundles, and the 4 words she gave Harlan Rourke over the fence. Before the winter was done, every man who laughed at that reed would stand in the cold outside her low golden door, with his hat in his hands. The name came before the frost did. It was one of the Deal children who said it first, pointing across the flat at the shaggy golden mound of the finished house with its steep reed roof and its reed-clad walls, and calling it a bird's nest. The word was too good not to keep. By the time the wheat was in, the whole settlement called the Vance place the bird's nest, and they did not mean it kindly. Men said it at the store, grinning. Amos Deal, who ran the store and weighed the flour and knew everybody's business, took to asking travelers if they'd seen the nest yet, the one the widow had built, and watching their faces when they realized he meant a house a woman meant to live in through a Dakota winter. There was an evening at the store that a good many people remembered afterward, when the talk turned to the reed as it always did. Amos Deal leaned on his counter with the lamp between his hands and put the question to the room. "Anybody here ever winter under weed?" he said. "Anybody's father? Anybody's father's father?" Nobody had. That settled it, as far as the men were concerned. A thing that had never been done at Reed Lake was a thing that could not be done. And never mind that Reed Lake was 6 years old and had barely done anything at all yet. "She'll be cutting that roof up for stove wood by February," one of the younger men said. "Burning her own house down to stay warm inside it. If a spark don't burn it for her first," said Amos Deal, and the men laughed low, so the women at the dry goods shelves would not hear them being cruel about a widow. And the lamp threw their shadows up big and moving on the plank wall, and outside the first cold of the autumn was already coming down over the wheat. They made a wager of it, as men will. Harlan Rourke and Amos Deal and 2 or 3 others put $1 each in a tin can, and the bet was on the reed. Some said the first hard gale would peel the roof. Some said the reed would rot black with the first wet snow and slump off the poles in a heap. The tin sat on the shelf behind the counter all autumn, and every man who came in looked at it and grinned, and the winter got closer, and nobody at Reed Lake, not one of them, had any idea what the widow had actually built. What she had built was warmth, not luck, not folly, not a widow's confusion. Warmth, engineered out of the one free thing the timber-poor plains gave her in abundance, and the town could not see it, because they were looking at the reed and thinking of birds. They should have been thinking of air. A cattail stem is hollow. Cut it green and dry it slow and it stays hollow. A long, stiff tube of dead air sealed at every joint. Bind 900 of those bundles tight against a wall and pin them 2 feet deep, and you have not built a wall of weed. You have built a wall of trapped air, 1,000,000 still pockets of it, and still air is the finest thing a cold country ever found for holding heat where you want it held. It is why a goose does not freeze on an open pond. It is why the old people in the wet, cold countries across the water, in the reed country and the moor country, had roofed their houses in bound reed for 1,000 years and slept warm under it while the wind came off the sea. Ellen Vance had not invented anything. She had remembered something. Some knowledge carried west in a grandmother's talk and dismissed by everyone else as a poor woman's roofing. And she had bent her whole summer to it because she had buried one person to the cold already and did not intend to bury another. She had thought about the snow, too, which was more than the town gave her credit for. A flat reed roof would have caught the drift and held it and rotted under the weight of it by March. So she had pitched hers steep on purpose, steeper than any roof in the settlement, so the snow slid before it could sit, and what little stayed only sealed the reed tighter and laid its own dead air blanket over the top. She had reasoned out the stove and set it dead center in the one room so that no wall stood far from it. She had thought about the door, cut low and small and hung to swing inward so that a drift could never lock her family inside. Every part of the bird's nest that the town had laughed at was a thing she had reasoned out alone at a table by a lamp, in the long nights after Samuel died, with a child asleep in the next room, and a whole winter coming on, and nobody to build the answer but herself. Etta worked beside her mother all that summer, small hands holding the split willow rods while Ellen pinned the courses home. The child did not understand the house yet, only that it was theirs, and that her mother would not stop until it was done. "Why can't we build it like the Rooks?" Etta asked her once, high on the ladder, watching Harlan's clean painted walls across the flat. "Theirs is straight. Theirs is cold," Ellen said. She took a bundle from the child and set it in its course and drove the willow rod down through it into the one below. "Feel how light this is. All hollow inside every stem of it. The cold comes off the flat and gets lost in all that hollow, trying to find its way through. And by the time it does, girl, spring's come." Etta put her hand flat against the finished wall as her mother had, and felt nothing but dry reed, warm from the sun. "Will it keep out Papa's kind of cold?" the child asked, and Ellen was quiet a moment on the ladder with a bundle in her hands. "It'll keep ours out," she said. "That's what I can do for you. So that's what I'm doing." Then she went back to the pinning, course over course, up the steep pitch of the roof, and the child held the rods, and the house grew its thick golden skin, one bundle at a time, while the town leaned on its fences and watched and shook their heads. Martha Deal walked out to the Vance place once in the last warm week of the fall on the excuse of returning a borrowed pan, though everyone knew Amos had sent her to see the folly up close. She stood in the yard and looked up at the great shaggy golden wall of it and did not quite know where to put her eyes. "Ellen," she said carefully, "folks are saying things about the reed, about a fire getting into it some night. I know what folks are saying. Amos means it kindly. He only worries you'll come to grief out here alone, is all. Amos put $1 in a can that I'll be dead by spring," Ellen said, without heat, taking the pan from her hands. "That is not worry, Martha. That is sport." She looked up at the roof for a moment. "Come the bad weather, my door's open to you and yours. That's the only thing ever wants saying between women out here. The men can keep their can." Martha Deal went home and did not repeat the last part to Amos, and she remembered every word of it 4 months later, standing in that same yard, wrapped in a quilt with the drifts to her knees, waiting to be let in. The plank houses of Reed Lake were the opposite of what she had made. A sawn board is a fine thing, straight and square and quick to raise. But a board is solid clean through, and solid things carry heat straight out of a house and hand it to the wind. Harlan Rourke's tidy walls were an inch of pine and a coat of paint. The wind found every seam. When his stove roared, the heat ran up the boards and out through the roof and away across the flat. And he fed the stove harder, and the heat left faster, and that was the bargain every plank house on the plains had made without knowing it. They were warm as long as the wood held out and the fire was fed. They were only ever as warm as their next armload of split cordwood. Ellen split her own cordwood too, that autumn. But she did not need much, and she knew it. And here was the quiet arithmetic nobody in town had done. She had built a house that held the heat it was given. They had built houses that spent it. All winter the difference would come down to a single small stove in the middle of her one room, an iron box no bigger than a trunk, and whether it could hold a house warm on an armload of wood a day while the men next door burned through a cord a week and shivered. The first snow came in the middle of November, wet and heavy, the kind Amos Deal had bet would rot the reed off the poles. It clung to the steep roof and slid, most of it, the way water slides off a duck, and what stayed froze into a smooth white cap that sealed the reed tighter than before. Harlan Rourke walked past the next morning on his way to the store and looked hard at the roof, expecting the black slump of rotting weed, and saw instead a clean white peak with a thread of smoke standing straight up off the chimney into the cold, still air. He did not say anything about it at the store. Neither did anybody else. The tin sat on the shelf. The bet was not settled. There was a great deal of winter still to come. It came in January, and it came the way the plains save their worst, all at once and without much warning. A gray morning, a wind that started out of the northwest and did not stop, and by noon the air was so full of driven snow that a man could not see his own barn from his own porch. The old people afterward called it the 3-day blow. It was not the cold alone, though the cold was murderous. It was the cold and the wind together, for 3 days and the better part of a fourth, so that no man could keep a fire fed and see to his stock and stay alive in the space between. And the settlement of Reed Lake pulled its doors shut and hunkered down to wait the storm out the only way it knew how, which was to burn wood and pray the wood lasted. And the wood did not last. That was the arithmetic the whole settlement had gotten wrong together. A plank house in a still cold is one thing, but a plank house in a 3-day wind is a sev, and every stove at Reed Lake was roaring against a draft it could not win. Stacks that were meant to see a family into March went down in a matter of days. A man would carry in an armload and feed it, and feel the cold walk back into the room behind him before the bark had even caught. By the second night, families were breaking up furniture and feeding it to the stove. By the third, some were burning the fence rails they could reach without dying in the open, and the smoke over the settlement thinned and guttered house by house as the fuel ran out, and the fires went small, and then went dark. Harlan Rourke had a cord and a half split and stacked against his south wall when the blow started. He was a careful man, and he thought it was plenty. He had a thermometer, too, a good one, a gift from a brother back east, and he had nailed it up inside by the door because he liked to know a thing exactly. When the storm hit, the needle inside his house stood at 68, and he fed the stove and felt fine about the winter and the wager and the widow all at once. By the end of the first day, the needle in Harlan Rourke's house read 50. He had the stove packed and glowing, and the wind was pulling the heat out through the pine walls faster than the fire could make it. By the morning of the second day, it read 40, and his wife had the children in the bed under every quilt in the house, and Harlan had burned through more than half his stack. By the second night, it read 30, and the wind had not slackened, and outside in the dark the thermometer would have read 40 below if he'd had the nerve to go out and look, and the cottonwoods down by the slough were splitting with a crack like rifle fire as the sap froze and burst them open from the inside. Harlan Rourke sat up all that second night, feeding a stove that could no longer warm his own front room, watching the needle by the door, watching his cordwood go, and doing the arithmetic he should have done in September. His wife spoke to him once out of the dark of the bed, past midnight, with the children packed around her under every quilt they owned. "Harlan," she said. "The Vance place." "I know it," he said. "The children are cold, Harlan. I can't get them warm." "I know it," he said again, and there was nothing else in him to say, because he did know it. He had known it since the needle passed 40, and knowing it was its own kind of cold. He sat by a stove that had stopped being able to warm him, and he listened to the wind come off 2,000 miles of frozen flat, and he thought about a low golden door 40 rods away, and a woman with reed dust on her apron who had told him plainly over a fence in the sun exactly what her house would do. "It keeps the heat." 4 words. He had gone home that evening and told his wife the widow had gone strange with grief. He fed the last good length of cordwood into the stove and watched it catch, and knew it would not be enough, and knew that in the morning, if they lived to the morning, he was going to have to break a path across those drifts and knock on the door of the house he had laughed at. Across the flat, behind 2 feet of pinned reed, the Vance house held. Ellen had a thermometer of her own, a cheap tin-backed one Samuel had bought at the store their first spring, and she had it up on the wall by the stove out of an old habit of his. On the first morning of the blow it read 58. She fed the little iron box 1 split length of cottonwood, and she banked it, and she got Etta up and set her at the table with a slate, and Tuck lay against the child's feet, and the wind screamed across the roof 2 feet above their heads and could not get in. At noon the thermometer read 58. That evening it read 57. She fed the stove again, 1 length, and banked it again, and the house held its warmth as a stone holds the day's sun into the night, giving it back slow, and the 2 feet of dead air in the walls and the roof kept the winds cold on the outside of the reed where it belonged. On the second day, while Harlan Rourke was burning through the last of his stack to hold his front room at 30, Ellen Vance's tin thermometer read 56, and she baked bread. She had the flour, and she had the warmth, and she had a daughter who needed to see her mother do an ordinary thing on a terrible day, so she baked, and the smell of it filled the one warm golden room, while the worst storm in the history of that country tried and failed to get through the reed. Etta played on the floor with the dog. "Is it the bad storm?" the child asked once, looking up at the roof where the wind was tearing past. "Is it the one everybody was scared of?" "It's the one," Ellen said, and slid the loaf into the oven. Let it blow. The stove ticked. Outside, 40 miles of open plain lay under a killing wind, and inside the bird's nest it was warm enough to work in shirt sleeves. That was the thing the town had bet against and lost. Not that the reed would hold up a wall. Any fool could see it held up a wall. What they had bet against, without ever putting it into words, was the idea that a woman alone could outthink all of them. That the poorest-looking house on the flat could be the warmest. That 2 feet of marshweed could beat an inch of good pine so badly it was not even a contest. The reed did not just keep Ellen Vance and her daughter alive through the 3-day blow. It kept them comfortable. It kept them baking bread. And 40 rods away, a careful man with a good thermometer and a full stack of split wood sat in a coat in his own kitchen and watched the needle fall and understood, at last, exactly what she had meant over the fence in the summer, when she gave him his 4 words and carried her reed inside. The wind broke on the 4th morning. It did not stop so much as tire, as those storms do, the scream falling off to a hard, steady blow, and then to a cold silence so complete that the settlement came up out of its buried houses blinking like people who had not expected to see the sun again. And what they saw, those who could see across the flat at all through the drifts, was one thread of smoke. Every plank house at Reed Lake stood cold that morning, their fires burned down to gray ash, their people gone across the drifts in the last of the storm to crowd into the 2 or 3 houses that still had wood, or gone still and quiet under their quilts waiting for a warmth that was not coming. Only the bird's nest, the widow's foolish, shaggy golden house beside the frozen slough, had smoke standing off its chimney into the still, cold air, as it had every morning of the storm, because inside it a single small fire was still holding a whole house warm. Harlan Rourke came first. He came because he had to, because his cord and a half was gone, and his thermometer read 20 and falling, and his children were blue-lipped under the quilts, and there was nowhere left in the settlement with heat to spare that he could reach through the drifts except the one place he had laughed at all autumn. He broke a path across the flat with his shoulder to the wind and his youngest on his back and the others stumbling behind. And he came up out of the snow to a low door set into a wall of golden reed. And he stood there a moment, a proud man at the end of his pride. And then he knocked. The door opened and warmth rolled out of it into the killing cold like something solid. Ellen Vance stood in the light of it with flour still on her hands. She looked at Harlan Rourke and his blue-lipped children and the wife behind them wrapped in a quilt, and whatever she might have said, whatever 4 words she might have chosen for the man who had told her she'd be sleeping under stars by October, she did not say any of them. "Come in out of it," she said. "There's room by the stove." And she stood aside, and they came in, all of them, into the one warm golden room. And Etta moved her slate to make space, and the dog Tuck thumped his tail against the floor, and Harlan Rourke's children sat down close to the little iron stove that had held the whole house through 3 days of the worst storm the country had ever thrown. And slowly, the blue went out of their lips and the color came back into their faces in the light of a fire built out of marsh weed and dead air, and one widow's refusal to be told. Amos Deal came within the hour, with his own family, having seen from his cold store window the one thread of smoke off the nest and understood exactly what it meant. He stood in her doorway stamping the snow off his boots and could not quite bring himself to look at her. "Mrs. Vance," he started. About all of it, the bread's on the stove," Ellen said, before he could find the end of the sentence. "Get those children in by the fire." Amos, he got the children in by the fire. Then came the 2 other men who had put their dollars in the tin. Then came a family from the far side of the settlement who had no other place left to go. By the middle of that 4th day, the widow's small house, the house the whole town had called a bird's nest and bet against and pitied, held more than a dozen people alive and warm around one stove, while the drifts stood to the eaves outside, and the thermometer in every plank house at Reed Lake read the same as the open air. She fed them bread. She melted snow for water on the stove that never once had to work hard. She put the children nearest the fire and the men by the door, and she did not once, that anyone who was there ever reported afterward, say a single word about the summer, or the fence, or the wager, or the name they had given her house. She did not have to. The reed said it. The warmth said it. The bread going around that crowded golden room said it plainer than any speech she could have made. And every man who took a piece of it knew exactly what he was being told, and exactly who had been right, and the knowing sat in them a good deal harder than any words of hers could have. Late on that 4th night, with the children asleep in a heap near the stove and the wind gone to nothing outside, Harlan Rourke spoke to her low across the warm room, because it had to be said, and he was the kind of man who said the hard thing once, and then let it lie. "You told me plain," he said, "over the fence. 4 words, and I went home and called you addled to my own wife." He looked at the golden wall, at the reed his own hands had helped to mock. "I don't believe I've ever in my life been so glad to be wrong about a thing." Ellen looked at his children asleep by her stove. "Then be glad quiet," she said. "There's folks still cold out there tonight that didn't make it this far." And Harlan Rourke was quiet, and was glad quiet, and did not forget it as long as he lived. There was a tin on a shelf at the store with $4 in it, and a wager nobody wanted to settle now. When the drifts finally went down enough for Amos Deal to open his store again, he took the tin off the shelf, and he did not say what he did with the money, but the next spring, when the Vance widow needed a new mule and did not have the price of one, a good young mule turned up in her lot one morning, with no note and no name attached, and Amos Deal looked hard at his own boots whenever anybody mentioned it. and that was the nearest thing to an apology the men of Reed Lake knew how to make. The knowing changed the settlement, as a hard winter changes a country. When the ground thawed and the building weather came back, Harlan Rourke walked down to the slough one morning with a billhook in his hand, and he stood at the lip of the water looking at the cattail coming up green and thick in the shallows, the same weed he had leaned on his fence and mocked. And then he waded in and began to cut. He was not a fool. He had buried the notion of his own cleverness under 3 days of falling numbers, and it had not come back up. He came to her first, though, before he cut a single stem, and stood in her yard with his hat in his hands. "I don't know how it's done," he said, "the pinning, the depth of it. I'd take it kindly if you'd show me." So she showed him. By the end of that summer there was a reed roof on the Rourke place, laid 2 feet deep in the widow's own pattern, because he had asked and she had shown him, and neither of them had said one word about October or the stars. Amos Deal put Reed over his store, a young couple newly come to the lake, who had heard the whole story at the store as you hear everything at a store. Roofed their first house in Reed before they ever built the walls up straight, and asked the widow to come look it over when they were done. 3 more Reed roofs went up along Reed Lake that summer, and then more the summer after, until a traveler coming through would have seen a whole settlement of steep golden roofs standing along the water, and would have thought it the most natural thing in the world. A Reed country roofing itself in Reed. The name came apart slowly, and then all at once. For a while the children still said bird's nest, out of habit, as children keep a word after the meanness has drained out of it. And then even that stopped, because there were a dozen of them now, and you could not call a whole town a nest of birds. In the end they just called them the Reed Roofs, and the men who had put dollars in a tin to bet a widow would freeze grew old under roofs they had learned to build from her, and warmed their grandchildren through blizzard after blizzard on an armload of wood a day, and did not much like to tell the part of the story where they had laughed. Ellen Vance lived a long time in that house. Etta grew up under the reed and married a man from down the lake and raised her own children warm, and the dog Tuck lived out his years by the little iron stove and was buried at the edge of the wheat near the wooden marker, and the reed was replaced course by course as the years wore it thin, cut green from the same slough every few summers as you'd mend any good thing that had earned its keep. The 2 feet of dead air never failed her. Through every winter the country sent, some of them nearly as bad as the 3-day blow. Hers stayed the warm house, the sure house, the one the neighbors' children ran to when their own fires ran low. People at Reed Lake told the story of the winter of 1887 for the rest of their lives, and they told it more or less honestly, which is more than most towns manage about a thing that shames them. They told about the wind and the falling thermometers and the cottonwoods splitting like gunfire in the dark. They told about the cold plank houses and the blue-lipped children and the long walk across the drifts to a low golden door. But when the very old ones told it, the ones who had been children warm on that floor by that stove, they did not spend much time on the laughing. The laughing had been the least true thing about that winter, and they knew it, and it fell away out of the telling a little more with every year that passed. What they remembered was the smoke, one thread of it standing straight up off a chimney into the still cold air on the 4th morning, when every other fire in the settlement had gone to ash. They remembered the warmth rolling out of an open door like something you could lean against. They remembered a woman with flour on her hands telling a proud man there was room by the stove, and meaning it, and feeding the men who had mocked her without ever once making them eat the mockery along with the bread. People forgot the laughing. What they remembered was whose fire was still warm.